Okay, well, it's 12:05, and this is the UC Center Sacramento Speaker Series. Welcome. I'm Richard Kravitz. I'm the director here at the center, and it's great to welcome you to this first talk of our quarter, in which we continue with our 2021-22 theme of emerging from the pandemic, promoting health and prosperity for all Californians in the wake of COVID-19. Well, pandemic or not, food sustainability is an important issue for California and for the world, made all the more acute now because of the ongoing horrible conflict in Ukraine. I should mention that this talk is co-sponsored by the Berkeley Food Institute, which is really an amazing collaboration between multiple UC Berkeley schools and departments, and my understanding is over 150 faculty. So our speaker today is Dr. Charisma Acey. Dr. Acey is Associate Professor of City and Regional Planning and Faculty Director of the Berkeley Food Institute. As you can read in her bio, her work focuses on poverty reduction, community participation in urban governance, food security, and environmental justice. She's well prepared for that task. She has a PhD in urban planning from UCLA, and her work has taken her all over the world, in particular to South America and many countries in Africa. She'll be speaking today on environmental justice and the food system in California, how urban agroecology can support healthy, sustainable communities. Before we bring Dr. Acey to the fore, just a word about the format for questions. For today's session, we will be taking questions in the Q&A function provided by Zoom. We will not be taking live questions. So you're welcome to type in your questions at any time during the session, and staff from the Berkeley Food Institute and I will handle the questions later and triage them and group them for Dr. Acey. So now, with no further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Charisma Acey.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kravitz, for the very kind introduction. I also want to thank Sandra Wilson, Cindy, Brooke, Sua, everyone at UC Center Sacramento for organizing today's event. And thank all of you who are on today's call for attending. I'm very excited to be here to talk about today's topic. With that, let me share my screen. Hopefully you all can see my slides. So as Dr. Kravitz mentioned, I'll be talking about environmental justice and the food system in California, and this concept of urban agroecology and how it can support the creation of healthy and sustainable communities. So this is an overview of today's talk. I've broken it up into 4 parts. In the first part, I'll be talking about bringing environmental justice and food justice in California together, which leads to this idea of community food security. And then transitioning to talk about agroecological urbanism, which offers a framework for how we can achieve it by breaking with the logics of urbanization patterns that destroy soils and soil life, marginalizes farmers, and makes people living in cities dependent on highly linear and commodified food supply chains. And then third, we'll talk about urban agroecology in the East Bay, and I'll talk about 2 projects I've been involved in, one funded by the UC Global Food Initiative, and another one on sustainable urban farming to meet food needs, funded by the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research and the Berkeley Food Institute, that was launched in 2018 as an 3-year interdisciplinary collaborative project focused on food justice through the lens of urban agroecosystems, economic viability, and food security in the East Bay and beyond. And then lastly, we'll end with some strategies and policy ideas that emerge from the project that offer ways to scale effective urban farming and secure the long-term viability of urban food producers and increase healthy food access. So we're going to get through all of that today. But first, let's talk about environmental justice. It is a movement that emerged out of the US Civil Rights Movement. It really became a national political movement in 1982 after the state-sanctioned dumping of cancer-causing PCB onto a Black farming town in Warren County, North Carolina. which led to protests that became nationally aware. And Dr. Benjamin Chavis was one of the civil rights leaders who led the protests and first coined the term environmental racism to describe the unfair exposure of racialized groups, the poor and marginalized communities, to harms associated with hazardous waste, resource extraction, and other land uses, which are also tied to the exploitation of workers and land. Over time, through hundreds of protests, studies, environmental justice has become a global movement and has focused on the pursuit of fairness in environmental and land use decision-making, especially the fair treatment of all races, ethnic groups, and socioeconomic classes. And so the movement has used political activism, civil rights, constitutional law, environmental law, and new policies at all levels of government to pursue this fairness and to empower low-income communities and communities of color to shape the environments where they live and work. And so on the screen here, we have a map of the state's Cal EnviroScreen Index. This is the fourth iteration of the index, 4.0. It's hosted on the site of the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. And it's one of the tools we now have to understand environmental justice in the state and support policies, funding, to address it. It uses 21 indicators of pollution and pollution burden and population characteristics to create an index by census tract of environmental burdens. And tracts in the top percentile are classified as disadvantaged and potentially eligible for different types of state funding. So the red area is the most striking, as you see on the map, and it runs right down the middle of the state through the Central Valley, especially the San Joaquin Valley. So according to the California Department of Agriculture's 2019 Agricultural Statistics Review, the top 5 agricultural counties in California were Fresno, Kern, Tulare, Monterey, and Stanislaus counties in that order. Now, the irony is that the San Joaquin Valley is one of the world's most productive agricultural regions, home to 4 million people, but it has some of the nation's worst air quality, high rates of childhood asthma, and contaminated drinking water. And we see this reflected in the Cal EnviroScreen Index. As we look at this same region in terms of food access, so on the screen, you see the USDA's definition of food desert. I'm going to come back to that because it's a problematic term, but it's one way that the USDA uses to understand areas of a form of food insecurity. And so it measures areas with low income, where poverty rates are greater than 20%, or median family income is 80% of the statewide or metropolitan area median family income, and then low access to food, where people live more than 1 mile or more from a supermarket or large grocery store in urban areas and more than 10 miles in rural areas. So as I was preparing for this project, I found this awesome story map prepared by a UC Santa Barbara student, Michael Leslie, on agriculture and food access in California. And so I took a screenshot and put it here along with the link so you can see her full project. But it shows that in 2019, 6.6% of the census tracts in California were flagged as food deserts. And comparatively, in the 4 counties that produce the most food, they have high rates. Their high rates of tracts in those counties are food deserts. 18% in Kern, 21% in Tulare County, 14% in Fresno, and almost 10% in Stanislaus County. So 4 of the 5 counties that produce the most food in the state have food insecure populations by one measure. And even when you look at the data separately, if you look at low income and low food access, you see high rates of both low income and low food access in these counties. So all of these top agricultural counties are way above the state average by both measures. For example, Kern County has more than 66% people who are low income and 40% who have low food access. Tulare County, almost 80% low income, 31% food access. And there's similar stats in the other counties. So the areas of the state the country that are producing the most food are also the most polluted and where people are the most, have the least food access. So here we're zooming in, and when you zoom in to the CalEnviro data, you see there's a lot of red in smaller census tracts, right, that are characteristics of urban areas where there's much more population density. So when we zoom in on the Bay Area, you can see the areas that are the most red on the left are parts of Richmond up here in the top. There's a Chevron refinery up here. And then moving down through Berkeley, West Berkeley, South Berkeley into Oakland, where you have the Port of Oakland, and moving further down in the East Bay, further south in the East Bay. These are communities that have experienced redlining, where there were racially restrictive covenants. They've been impacted by the urban renewal, the freeway boom, all kinds of discriminatory and unjust land use decision-making that has also made the same communities environmentally burdened. And so on the right is a map that was part of the project funded by the UC Global Food Initiative, where we were looking at overlaying CalEnviro indicators with the USDA low income, low food access metrics and other measures of food insecurity. And we were exploring the connections between environmental justice, food justice, and climate adaptation using Richmond, California as a case study. And so we combined those measures with state investments and anticipated changes in regional land use related to climate change policy, like the Sustainable Community Strategy, which requires regions to identify priority development areas for housing to reduce urban sprawl, as well as priority conservation areas. We combine that with parcel level data to identify for opportunities for food-related investments that improve health and sustainability. What we found is that food access and insecurity is an important environmental indicator not captured by CalEnviro. Now, the likely reason for that is that the relationship between food environment and health has historically been difficult to measure, given the lack of standardized metrics for measuring food, environment, and population risk. However, there are studies that exist, like the California Department of Public Healthy Communities Data and Indicators Project, which shows a really robust link between the presence of healthy food retail and morbidity. And so such findings offer a really compelling argument for tracking food environment as a potential environmental hazard. So on the right, like I said, we have CalEnviro. This was an earlier version of CalEnviro 3.0. The areas in dark blue are those tracks in the 75th percentile. So those match up with the red areas in 4.0. There's some changes because each version of CalEnviro that comes out updates the indicators. And so it changes a little bit, but you see, parts of Richmond, the Iron Triangle, areas very near the Chevron refinery are still on the left are also still red and the most polluted. Similarly, areas near the Port of Oakland, near the freeways that run through those communities. So we added that with the USDA metrics, as well as this new metric, the CDC's Modified Retail Food Environmental Index indicator. It's used to identify census tracts within states and communities that either lack access to healthy food retail, such as supermarkets, or that contain very high densities of fast food restaurants and convenience stores. And so that project found that in California found that areas with fewer than 17% of healthy food retail had a 20% higher prevalence of obesity. They also had 23% higher prevalence of diabetes than communities with at least a quarter healthy food outlets, regardless of demographic factors like income, race, ethnicity, age, gender, or level of physical activity. So we thought including that indicator was important because the few longitudinal studies that exist of food interventions and health outcomes show that simply building a supermarket alone is not a panacea, given the complexity of factors that frustrate food security. Some of these are place-based factors that include lack of transit, social distance, the lack of culturally appropriate foods, social norms, and competing retail, as well as income and many, many more. So what you're basically seeing on the right are communities that score, where you see the dark blue, where there's also an overlay of the yellow and gray crosshatch, are areas that are high, both in terms of the USDA metrics of food access and the CDC metric of lack of healthy food retail and exposure to excessive high fast food. All are areas that merit attention and state public investment that support healthy food environment and food access. So the blue areas are burdened by environmental pollution as well as a hazardous food environment, but you also have areas that are not captured by a cal enviro screen that also are hazardous food environments that also impact human health. So let's talk about food insecurity in the East Bay. It's not spread evenly. Almost 800,000 Bay Area residents are experiencing some form of food insecurity, but there are specific communities that are overburdened, as well as students on our campus. We've created a basic needs committee and major interventions to address food insecurity on campus. It's an estimated 42% of UC students experience food insecurity. In the East Bay, Alameda, and Contra Costa counties have the highest rates, 12% of residents experiencing food security. We don't like to use the term food desert. Activists fight against that term, which implies this idea of the lack of healthy food retail or food or opportunities to eat, consume, and utilize food as some kind of natural phenomena that has kept fresh food away from certain communities, rather than putting the focus on the systemic decision-making around land use, as well as past racial and current and ongoing legacy of racial discrimination and systemic disinvestment. So many activists use the term food apartheid to call attention more to the kind of deliberate creation of areas that lack healthy food access. However we refer to it, the East Bay fails to provide affordable, equitable access to fresh, healthy, and culturally diverse foods for low-income and historically marginalized communities. I also want to talk about and highlight how low food security impacts children in the region with an example. Over 70% of Oakland Unified School District students qualify for free or reduced lunch, which means they live in low-income households, and many of which are at risk of food insecurity. And so the persistent risk of hunger and poor health outcomes also impacts education outcomes. And for this reason, in 2010, Oakland Unified partnered with the Center for Eco-Literacy to launch the Rethinking School Lunch Oakland initiative. And the whole idea is that it's a school meal reform plan premised on the notion that there's no one intervention that can increase student consumption of healthy food. Among the many pathways to change, this program incorporates integrating school gardens into school curriculums, connecting students to growing fruits and vegetables, and nutrition education into the school curriculum. So I've just started working with co-associate faculty director Susana Matias at the Berkeley Food Institute, and the Institute of Urban and Regional Development researcher Maura O'Neill Hudson, and a group of graduate and undergraduate students partnering with Oakland Unified Central Kitchen staff to design an evaluation of this program so we can create an evidence base for the effectiveness of this kind of holistic model of food and nutrition intervention. So this takes us to this idea of community food insecurity, as community food security, sorry. So the metrics that the Department of Agriculture uses talks about food security at the household level, right? So it means access by all members of the household at all times to enough food for an active and healthy life. Hunger, we talk a lot when we talk about food security, we talk about hunger. It's related to food insecurity, but it is different. Hunger is at the individual level, a physiological condition that can result from food insecurity. So there are no direct metrics that we have on hunger, but we have these metrics of food insecurity. So it focuses on ready, available, of nutritionally adequate and safe food, and assuring the ability to acquire food and acceptable food in a socially acceptable way, without resorting to emergency foods, scavenging, stealing, or other kind of coping strategies, which are symptoms of food insecurity. So they have metrics on low and very low food insufficiency. But a broader aspect is, or a concept is community food security. And that concept grows out of activists, scholars of environmental justice and food justice, which have really been two kind of distinct movements coming. There have been conferences, there have been some articles that try to bring the concepts from the two movements together, finding what's common to both. And so community food security links food availability, access, and nutrition to regional land use, to transportation and public health. It highlights the inequalities in which groups lack continuous physical and economic access to enough nutrient-rich, healthy, and culturally relevant food, and to food production avenues that could contribute to active, healthy living and environments. And it's also related to the concept of a community food system, which includes the people, the land, the infrastructure, and interdependent processes of food from farm to table to disposal. So the question is, how do we achieve community food security? So I want to introduce this idea of agroecological urbanism. It comes from a growing global grassroots movement of activism and scholarship around agroecological transitions. And the term specifically refers to a type of farming that emphasizes ecological non-chemical practices, as well as social justice and sovereignty. And so it originates in the global South and diversified and peasant farming communities like La Via Campesina, which is a global social movement. And it's described as simultaneously science, movement, and practice. And when we talk about agroecological urbanism, we're talking about urban environments that merge, these just and equitable and ecologically sustainable food production practices with spaces that promote ecological function and other kinds of green spaces in cities that support and enhance healthy, productive communities that are resilient to a changing climate. So in our research, this was from this diagram is from a systemic review of the literature that we did with my colleague, Jenny Sauerwein, who's the lead principal investigator of the project I'll be talking about more shortly. And she's with the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management and UCANR at Berkeley, and Dr. Lainey Siegner, who was a graduate student at the time. And we sought to critically analyze the urban agriculture and urban food systems literature in order to understand the impact of urban produced foods on community food security, looking at the role of planning, food policy, and civic engagement in creating spaces for urban agriculture in cities across the United States, and whether these spaces actually promote food justice and food security. And as you can see here, what we're trying to capture and see what the existing literature said is how the inputs of healthy soil, seeds, land, water, labor, a lot of unpaid labor, and equipment gets transformed on agricultural sites and result in food, health, jobs, environmental quality, improved environmental quality, more community building, and education. And these are some of the things we argue are not captured with a kind of productivist focus of urban, or exclusively productivist focus on urban agriculture. There are all these multiple benefits. And so we were calling for more studies that empirically document the impact of the outputs of urban agriculture and mapping strategic sites for urban agriculture, as well as distribution channels and food flows. So we were kind of building on the work that was started in Richmond, and it began the focus of our work in the East Bay. So in 2018, a collaborative of agricultural researchers, farm service providers, food policy, and scholars and educators received funding from BFI and the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research to partner with farmers and gardeners across the East Bay to support sustainable urban farming methods that improve ecological resilience and meet urgent food needs. And the whole idea is aligning the East Bay food system with food justice. And so part of our findings was that there are more than 120 urban farms and gardens across the East Bay. The majority, 77%, are nonprofit. They're focused on community, in terms of their mission, on community food security, education, environmental sustainability. 62% of them are headed by women, and with an average size of 1.88 acres growing diversified crops. So there are multiple farmers and gardeners that have worked to drive and formulate critical agroecological research and advocacy across the East Bay. So some examples, this is Acta Non Verba, a youth urban farming project founded in 2011 by the incredible Kelly Carlisle, a resident of Oakland who was just tired of reading all the negative headlines about her community and decided to do something about it. And so Acta Non Verba, elevates the quality of life in Oakland, right, by challenging oppressive dynamics, whether it's policing, whether it's gentrification, whether it's crime, through urban farming. So it's mostly led by women of color in surrounding neighborhoods and the larger community. And the idea is that it creates a safe and outdoor space for children, youth, and families in East Oakland. It strengthens young people's understanding of nutrition, food production, and healthy living, and strengthen their ties to the community. It also offers childcare, economic empowerment, and access to healthy food for a community that really needs it. And so it really embodies these multiple benefits of growing food in urban areas. This slide here is from the Giltrap Community Farm, which is located on one of UC Berkeley's experimental farm sites. And so volunteers at the Giltrap Community Farm, which is located in Albany, California, they actually grow and distribute 12,000 pounds of produce annually. And overall in this project, we found that urban farmers in the East Bay are providing food to approximately 250 individuals per farm weekly, while also providing educational workshops, urban green space, and social connections for local residents. That means over 8,700 individuals are receiving food on a weekly basis just from a subsection of those farms, 35 that participated in a survey that we did. And each of those farms average have about a half an acre inside. So if we extrapolated just from that subset of those 120 plus urban farms, you could imagine about 1,200 urban farms that were about a half acre apiece could supply fresh produce to about half of the residents of Berkeley, Oakland, and Richmond. So about 607,000 people, and because these are the most populous cities in the East Bay. And so there's a lot of potential for expansion as well into school and community gardens. So all in all, these farms really play an invaluable educational, cultural, social role. In addition to food production, they also provide ecological spaces for stormwater capture, carbon sequestration. A lot of these benefits are not really recognized in terms of policy. Here I want to talk about Oxford Tract, which is an experimental farm tract located on the UC Berkeley campus, about 4.5 acres, and it's right next to the main campus. And it has become a site of studying what's called till versus no-till agroecological research, where bio-intensive, heavy compost amendment, no-till practices, where you don't disturb the soil, are compared side by side with till cropping systems for diversified vegetable production. And there's evidence to show that no-till, like not disturbing the soil, increases carbon sequestration. And the findings are showing that you can generate the same amount of food with these more sustainable practices than with practices that use chemicals like pesticides. And so a paid farm manager oversees the experiment, and applying compost and forage and cover crop to break up soil compaction, and works with graduate student researchers as well as undergraduates to do soil testing, cropping, and recording of harvest measurements. The beauty of this project is that it's not only research. The food is then distributed among community organizations across the Bay Area, including the Student Food Pantry for the campus. It's a major supply of food for students in need, as well as cooperative housing groups, a local Indigenous land trust, and the employee-owned Cheese Board Collective. So this is a map just showing the distribution network from the Oxford Tract. So you can see all of the places that food grown there, in terms of all the community organizations that it reaches. So this is across the farms, those 35 farms that we surveyed, and we're looking at what happens to food that's grown in urban spaces. Now, what we found is that an average of 45% of food grown in the Bay Area is donated, signifying the importance of the solidarity economy that is focused on mutual aid. Farmers, staff volunteers in their sites, as well as campus sites, strengthen community self-sufficiency and well-being, through food distribution, but also by providing these workshops and experiential learning opportunities to aspiring urban food growers, as well as students and other members of the farming community. Now, when we looked at farm revenue, it's interesting because the Department of Agriculture defines farms as any place where $1,000 or more of agricultural products are produced and sold or would have been sold during the year. But as you see here, the majority of the farms that we surveyed, generate less than 1,000 a year. And so that's why, again, we argue that a productivist focused is somewhat problematic, because urban agriculture is an important component of food security, as we just mentioned, all the places where food goes, how it is feeding thousands of families a week. But it has other social and ecological benefits that are just as, and sometimes even more significant in terms of impact. And that was some of what we found in our lit review. And so a lot of times debates around urban agriculture lead to an unhelpful comparison with rural farms in terms of yield and productivity and economic viability and the ability to feed urban populations. But if we only think of it in that way, the radical transformative potential of urban food production spaces, as well as their preservation, gets pushed aside, especially in local planning decisions in regions where, like the Bay Area, where the threat of displacement is high, and there's high levels of economic inequality. So here's where agroecology offers a framework for thinking about an alternative form of development that can counteract the kind of typical conventional food system with all its paradoxes, with how it creates food insecurity for farm growing communities, as well as providing unhealthy food to urban areas. And we argue that applying an agroecological lens to the urban context invites researchers and urban planners and policymakers to think beyond garden plots and the singular benefits of food production, to think of each of these sites, like the 120 plus that you saw on the map earlier, as part of a larger agro-ecosystem with synergistic social, cultural, and ecological dimensions. And so these are kind of the 10 principles of agroecology that the UN Food and Agricultural Organization identified from a global conference convening grassroots groups, community organizations, academics, policymakers. And so these 10 principles of agroecology emerge. And so this is a useful framework kind of beyond just urban agriculture, that brings together the social values, the culture, the governance, the solidarity economy, all of these things that are really important for food production to be transformative. So in the last part of today's talk, I want to talk about the strategies and the policies that emerged from this project that was launched in 2018. Despite this growing civic movement to create spaces for urban agriculture in the US, we kind of lag behind other parts of the world, Europe notably, where it's embedded in policy and public health policy, and land is kind of set aside for residents because they recognize the benefit of urban food growing. So there has been interest, a flurry of research and activism around preserving urban food spaces. We find that public investment remains both inequitable and inadequate to support the diverse practices and practitioners growing food locally. A lot of the outcomes of urban agriculture are uneven or ad hoc, and are dependent on local champions or the result of resistance and really sustained advocacy. And this is due a lot because agriculture is not a standard urban land use designation or a central focus of urban policy making, despite decades of research demonstrating the health, food, environmental, and educational benefits of growing food in cities, as well as the full social, economic, and ecological values not being recognized in policy making. So in March of last year, we had our project culminated in a 2-week event with multiple sessions that explored themes such as ancestral healing through food and land stewardship. How do we achieve the just transition to agroecology that it's going to take, transferring power and restoring sovereignty to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color as land stewards? exploring public-private partnerships, the legal and policy dimensions of land access, as well as challenges and opportunities to strengthen agroecological resilience. So it brought together our community partners, our farmers, other advocates in the food system, policymakers, academics, students. It was a great event. And really some of the takeaways were that and it also included people from other parts of the country as well, sharing their experiences and struggles with preserving urban land for food production. And some of the takeaways were that urban farms and community and school gardens are sites of resistance and resilience. They can help in securing land and housing, and resist development and gentrification pressures by integrating housing and food production, as well as economic opportunities. That there are these really unrecognized solidarity economies, and that are important for resistance in a time of high extreme economic inequality. That urban farms and urban gardens provide soil and ecological regeneration and remediation, and restoration that address legacies of pollution, again, value that is not really recognized in policymaking. And they offer ways to preserve indigenous knowledge, ways, and practices, and offer opportunities for cross-cultural learning. On the left is an image of City Slicker Farms, another farm in the Bay Area. It started in West Oakland to meet basic needs for health, fresh, healthy food by creating sustainable, high-yield urban farms and backyard gardens. And here you see their rainwater harvesting system. I also study water is a big component of my research, access to water for communities. And so I had to capture that image, and they captured 2,800 of 800 gallons of rainwater a year to use for irrigating plants. So that's a form of green infrastructure. And so lastly, I just want to end on some of our policy recommendations. These are in a policy brief that came out of, that we published on the BFI website after this conference. And 6 main recommendations, as well as examples we offer for how to strengthen urban food production and resilience. And so number 1, increasing access and tenure security of municipal land, public and private, regional coordination that links public and private land, especially those urban-rural connections, through integrated programming, developing revenue generating opportunities for urban farms, especially through public investment, investing in public distribution infrastructure to get like refrigeration and delivery systems to get food from farms to people in need, and integrating urban agriculture into affordable housing, and exploring creative models of land tenure that exist, especially using publicly owned land, park spaces, other forms of municipal land that increase food and land sovereignty for communities of color. So, our findings find that there's a vibrant yet very precarious network of urban farms and gardens in the East Bay that provide critical services to vulnerable community members. They face a lot of significant insecurities related to land tenure, funding, revenue, food safety, labor, and food distribution capacity. And so our research really shows that these kinds of policies, which came from multiple, not just the survey, but multiple focus groups and being out in the community with the farms, a lot of these ideas emerged. And these policies, programs, funding, and other support systems are needed to really not only sustain, but expand agroecological spaces and allow them to serve as vibrant, protected green infrastructure in what will hopefully be the agroecological city of the future. So before ending today, I just want to acknowledge the many people that are behind the findings and what you see here. First and foremost, all of our community partners, all the various farms, activists, community-based organizations, folks in the charitable food system that we interviewed and that participated in the project, the whole Growing Roots collaborative team, Jenny Sauerwein, Tim Bowles, Rob Benetton with UCANR, as well as the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, which provided funding, as well as Berkeley Food Institute funding, as well as incredible support, Nina, and all of the staff at BFI, the UC Global Food Initiative, UCANR Cooperative Extension, as well as the Colleges of Natural Resources and Environmental Design and our departments at UC Berkeley. Tremendous amount of effort behind all of this. So with that, I want to thank you and look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
So thanks a lot, Dr. Acey, for just an excellent presentation. We're going to maybe give a few seconds for our staff to shut off the recording, and then we'll go to the questions. I see some questions are beginning to pour in. While we're waiting for